Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When I grew up, politics was discussed in terms of blacks, whites, and Hispanics, with the city's small Asian population thrown in as an afterthought. But blacks then meant American-born blacks. Hispanics meant Puerto Ricans, and Asian Americans meant only Chinese. Today, the black electorate includes hundreds of thousands of Caribbean Americans and a growing number of African immigrants. Latinos include similar numbers of Dominicans, as well as growing numbers of Mexicans, Colombians, Ecuadorians, Salvadorans, and others. And Asian Americans include major influxes from Korea, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Middle East. City is a lot more complicated today, and we are the better for it. The Democratic Party remains the most visible means of ethnic rite of passage in the city, and the results of the just recently concluded primary signal the likelihood that voters will send the first Korean American into the city council in the person of Kevin Kim, the first citywide elected Asian American in John Liu, who was going to be comptroller, and even though this may sound hard to believe, the first Chinese American to represent Chinatown in the person of Margaret Chen. It is not that long ago that we saw Una Clark become the first Jamaican-born woman elected to the city council, and Guillermo Linares become the first Dominican-American elected to any post in the nation when he became the council member from Washington Heights. And Barack Obama's election last year shows the racial and ethnic factors that so often dominated voting patterns have, to say the least, undergone a transformation. Since I work with the Onondaga Indian Nation on some issues, I cannot fail to acknowledge that this analysis ignores the history of how this country decimated the millions of natives who lived here for millennia before the arrival of the first European settlers. But setting that aside for the purposes of this discussion, whether we're a melting pot or a salad bowl or a gorgeous mosaic, it's worth remembering one of the favorite lines of former Mayor David Dinkins himself, an example of a first as the city's only African-American mayor. No matter whether we or our ancestors arrived in a steamship, an airplane, or in the hold of a slave ship, we're all in the same boat now. We're joined by four prominent New Yorkers to discuss what it all means for politics and for our city. Glenn Makpantai is a staff attorney with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund and an adjunct professor in the Asian American Studies program at Hunter College. Erica Gonzalez is the opinion page editor with El Diario La Prensa. Professor Ron Daniels is a distinguished lecturer at York College and the former executive director of the Rainbow Coalition. And Andrew Beveridge is a Queens College sociology professor and one of the city's most prominent demographers. Erica, let me start with you. This is, we're poised to see the city council, for example, have a majority of its members as members of minority groups. The word minority is kind of you have to stumble over it when everybody's a minority. Does that mean anything?
Well, it's promising, but one of my observations has been whether the Black, Latino, Asian caucus, even prior to this, has maximized its leverage and its ability to organize and really reach out to New Yorkers. So one of the things that I am concerned about as you have the executive consolidating more power and you have someone in the event that Mayor Bloomberg is reelected, someone who's really going to take a hatchet to the public advocate's office and God knows what else, is how much does that mean when you have the city council in less of a powerful position and most of the power concentrated in City Hall?
Glenn, is this because we are seeing, it wasn't that long ago we saw the first Asian American elected, which was, I guess, 8 years ago. Now we see two into the council. I'm sorry, three into the council, and we have our first citywide Asian American elected official poised to be. Is this a coming of age?
It's remarkable. We've seen Asian Americans grow over the years. Many more Asian Americans are naturalizing, they're registering to vote. They want to see City Hall represent them. They want to see a City Hall that represents a diverse mosaic of New York City. And so it's exciting to know that for the first time an Asian American will represent the city's largest voting bloc of Asian Americans in Chinatown. We'll have another Asian American in Flushing and the first Korean American here in Bayside in Queens. And so we're really excited to see a large number of Asian Americans triple in the city council. The question becomes, who are Asian Americans? And so Chinese and Koreans aren't the only Asian American groups. Indians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis are also growing in numbers. The question is whether our city government, whether the city council will reflect the diverse polity of the residents of the city. And that is some of the work that we're looking at. But for now, we're extremely excited about the elections, and we'll see what happens this coming November.
Ron, you've done political work for decades, and the very concept of the Rainbow Coalition hangs over a lot of what we're discussing. I mean, we have whether it's again a melting pot or a salad bowl or whatever it is. I mean, is the election of the Asians in particular kind of a sign of maturation, a sign of change?
Well, we hope so, and we think it is. And I think there are several key points to be made here. Number one is we hope that there'll be greater energy injected to the political process in this city by the new arrivals and people who are now becoming a part of the process. Because one of the sort of tragic things about politics in the city of New York is the abysmally low level of political participation. So hopefully there'll be tremendous energy injected to the system. The other thing I'm particularly proud about, particularly in John Liu's case, is obviously he needed a coalition. He could not have won simply with Asian votes. So that for African Americans and Latinos and labor and so forth to join in that coalition, as someone who is a proponent of the Rainbow Coalition, I found to be amazing and quite refreshing. The issue becomes now, as Erica was mentioning earlier, can city council people and others begin to forge a coalition that is a progressive coalition that really begins to transform fundamentally the way politics is done in this city? And that remains to be seen.
I want to come back to this question of progressivism in a second, but Andrew, it's obviously demographic changes precede voting demographic changes because of the question of citizenship. How different is the city than the one I grew up in, for instance?
Well, I think the city that you grew up in was largely white. I mean, there might have been some blacks there, but if you go back, 1950, the 1950
I
New
didn't
York...
grow up, that's a little bit before my time, but go ahead.
The 1950 New York looks pretty much like the suburbs look now in terms of demographics. And so one of the things that's happened is that there's been a shift. There was the Great Migration of the African Americans and the Great Migration of the Puerto Ricans, but both of them could vote immediately upon landing in New York if they were registered and chose to do so. But the more recent immigrants, from the Caribbean, from Mexico, from the Dominican Republic, from Bangladesh, from India, from China, and from Korea, from where else, cannot vote immediately upon arrival and have to work their way through the citizenship process. And it's a shocking fact, but the citizen voting age population, percent of the citizen voting age population, percent of the voting age population of, say, Asians who are registered to vote hovers around 35% who can register to vote, that is, who are citizens. Similarly, with Latinos, it's slightly higher for immigrant Latinos. So unlike the blacks or the Puerto Ricans who came, 100% of them could immediately register. For the new groups, it's only about 30 or 40%. And this is a major, major thing that happens. And so I think it's going to take quite a lot longer. I think the emergence of John Liu is a very important thing. And I think the point that Ron made about him building a coalition is the most important point, because there's no way for someone to represent one ethnic group in New York City and represent all of New York City. You have to draw together a coalition. And, and what that coalition entails will mean how the city is moved, which is kind of what Erica said. If it turns out the coalition is, say, the wealthy yuppies from Manhattan and their friends, and then the other people in New York don't vote. I mean, Bloomberg won last time with 15% of the people who could potentially vote voting. That is 15% of the citizens of voting age voting. Bloomberg got 15%. Freddie Ferrer got 10%. It was a little closer the election before.
Let me just pursue this question of progressive. I covered City Hall for many years as a reporter, and you seem to be equating minority membership with progressive politics. Are you
Not really.
Are you comfortable with that kind of a?
Not since Clarence Thomas. I wouldn't want to make that mistake.
Well, no, but even in the city council, I mean, I would argue with you that there was, that there were some very conservative minorities or kind of reactionary. I don't want, everybody in this city is on the liberal, even the conservatives are on the liberal end of a national, national spectrum. But I mean, I guess what I'm getting at, and I wanted everybody to jump in, does this presage a change in the politics of the city?
No, it's not automatic, because it's really not about the color, the skin color. It's about the content of the politics. But one hopes that given people's experiences, particularly being at the bottom of the ladder, being poor and working class, that this would translate. I mean, most of these groups are in the Democratic Party. But it does not mean necessarily that they will be at the cutting edge of progressive politics. That means that we've got to develop the instrumentalities, the institutes, the leaders who in fact will provide the training and the inspiration so that it is a progressive coalition. And I think at the center of that is increasing political participation. I mean, voting does not necessarily equal democracy for me, but I think we need to find a system by which we increase political civic engagement, civic participation, and that will therefore increase voting participation. Because in New York, if this is what democracy looks like in terms of voting, it's a pretty bad picture.
I think that, I'm really excited by some of the newer, some of the folks who've just been elected, from Idanis Rodriguez, Julissa Ferreras, who was elected a few months before in a special election.
From Washington
Councilman,
Heights and Jackson Heights,
Daniel Drum, just folks who really are really in tune with their communities, who really understand working class issues, who want to really push forward, with really concrete measures to help people who are poor and working class. And I think one of the things that should be on the agenda for progressives in the city council, and there has been talk about starting a progressive caucus, is really, if you're really committed to civic education, to voter participation, then make it mandatory in public high schools that everyone, at the age of 16, that you have to know how to vote. And I mean finding your electoral district, knowing how to, knowing what the process means, knowing how to engage, and really make it something concrete. Not this really voting by if you happen to know, or you happen to have like you have the luck of the draw of having a leader who's really engaged with your community.
How motivated were Asian Americans in particular? Was their turnout much higher this year?
Yeah.
I mean,
Very much. I mean, if you look at the districts, in which Asian Americans won, we did some exit polling at the Legal Defense Funds. We found that large numbers of Asian Americans were voting for the first time. Rates in the New York Times actually found that rates of voter turnout in those districts, District 20, District 1, District 19, actually had higher rates than the surrounding districts. It was, I think, 17% when the city was about 15%. So we saw a very energized, a very excited voting bloc. And remember, for Asian Americans, a large segment of them are not enrolled in any political party. Many are Democrats, but we've also found that a number of Asian Americans don't enroll. So in the upcoming elections, we're going to see a lot more Asian Americans who couldn't vote in the primary election vote in these upcoming general elections. And again, that will be exciting. They will see and be a part of the civic engagement and the civic process of America, and then we'll see what happens there. But I agree with Ron that we need to move the system and the issues beyond just voting, that holding our elected officials accountable. And I've yelled at John Liu too, right? Yelling at them, talking to them, writing those letters are very much the issues that I think our fabric of democracy is all about, and what we want to see new immigrants, new citizens of the United States participate in.
But I do think voting is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
Because in New York, I mean, we only get to 50% for presidential elections in New York. It was a little higher with Obama. But I mean, when you're talking about, 20, that someone can to choose the mayor with 12 or 13% of the vote, which is what happened when Bloomberg, 12 or 13% of the people who could potentially vote, voting for one candidate, particularly Bloomberg. When you have that, I mean, you don't have civic engagement, and I really am a kind of an evangelist. I agree with you 100%. We have to get the immigrants. We have to get them to become citizens. We have to get them on the voting rolls. We have to get them enrolled in a political party, because if they don't, there's no, that's the minimum of participation. If New York had 50 or 60% turnout, there wouldn't even be a discussion about progressive. Who votes? The rich people vote. I'm sure they turned out in Todd Hill, or the most Republican district in New York, or they will. I mean, that's who votes. It's the people who have something at stake, or think they have something at stake. The people who actually have something at stake but don't know it don't turn out. And then we get, basically autopilot and a mayor that gives everything to developers, pardon my comment.
Yeah, but the question,
How dare you say
but the question is, what is it that motivates people to vote?
Right.
You see, and that's where I've always had a problem, is that we somehow focus on voting as opposed to what happens between elections. In other words, if all the political process is going to mean in terms of, quote unquote, the definition of democracy is you go every 2 years, every 4 years you cast a ballot and that's it, then it seems to me we're going to continue to have low
That's
voter
the
participation.
minimum.
Yeah, I know it's the minimum, but I'm saying we must have, that's why I agree with Erica, we must have systems by which we encourage people. The mayor's voter assistance piece theoretically could have been something that could programmatically engage people in a way that encourages people to vote. Right now, it's, you vote for me every 2 years, bye-bye, I'll see you later. And we need a different kind of process. We need structures that hold people accountable. And it's not easy because, again, the rich people have the leisure and the privilege to be able to participate. Working class people, poor people perhaps don't, but we have to find ways to engage them. I think labor unions are a key structure that can potentially help with that. I remember years ago, 1199 used to sort of every couple of weeks convene a kind of a coalition at 1199 to talk. We need to revisit some of those kinds of things in order to get people
Well, they're
engaged.
still doing it. It's now called the Working Families Party, and they're also were doing it. It was called Acorn. But, that's, Acorn got attacked by the right-wing Republicans and kind of got taken into the penalty box, and the Working Families Party is basically a coalition of started as a coalition of a set of labor unions. So I mean, that's the same thing, and they go out and they do voter registration. I actually, to some extent, disagree with you, Ron. I think you're putting this at a very high plane. If you go out and you register people, you get them to vote, amazing things can happen. And I'll give you an example from one of the councilmen from Queens, Saunders. When he ran in 2001, he had in his back pocket a district that turned out in the primary roughly 100%. Now that district happened to be a Hasidic community out on the island. But he won the primary in Laurelton because he knew that those people would come out for him. And so I would argue that it's going to be the political leaders who go out and organize people, get them on the poll, get them registered, help them become citizens, and get them to the polls. That's how politics is done here. It's not done at a high level. It's who gets what, when, why. If people don't vote, they're not going to get it.
Right, but what's missing is the seamlessness that I think Ron is referring to. So when you have, people are only going to vote when they feel compelled, about an issue, inspired by a candidate where there's a mechanism that's mobilizing them. And we saw that on a national scale with Hispanic voters in the presidential election, where there was actually a wave of organizations that were acting cohesively to get people naturalized. That was the first wave. The second wave was to get them registered to vote. And the third one was to get them out to the polls. So it really has to be a continuous process. I mean, one of the things that I've heard from people, and it was registered by the Hispanic Federation when they did a survey recently, is like, I only see you, or I only see the group when it's in the election cycle. So that's why people have the impression that, my civic participation amounts to when I go cast my ballot. And I really feel like it's imperative that we really start cultivating this sense among young people that there is a duty, there's a responsibility, and that this is sort of like the order of things, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is just these sort of like hit and run kind of like come out and vote things, And then we have to get rid of a bunch of elected officials who are really not inspiring and doing right by these communities, So.
But that last point is not an ethnic point. It's a generational point. It's a machine point. It's a whole different. Because,
it's an intersection of points. Yes.
Because it's one thing to see highly motivated people come out to elect a Chinese American council member from Chinatown for the first time, to see Asians in particular, Asian Americans in particular, motivated to vote for John Liu, Dominicans with this sense of pride about Guillermo Linares, Caribbean, Jamaicans and the broader Caribbean community when Una Clark. When that first is not driving people, and ethnicity is a powerful, ethnicity and an ethnic identification, racial identification is a powerful motivating tool. I mean, we all have a sense of who we are as part of a larger group. How do you, I don't know that you can't keep that together. I don't know that you can keep that level of passion that drives you towards a first. I mean, look at, David Dinkins' re-election didn't have the passion of his first election.
There was passion on the other side.
Well, there is.
And in fact, a lot of people think Dinkins lost the second election because of the secession struggle in the secession vote in Staten Island that pulled out people in Staten Island who wanted to secede, who happened to vote against Dinkins. So, but those elections were almost identical.
Let me ask you this, because
I actually looked at those elections very carefully.
But you're talking about
like 30,000
the reaction.
swing.
You were talking about people who react against this ethnic assertion, this kind of, this in the degree to which you view ethnic arrival as some kind of an insurgency, that there's a reaction against that insurgency. And you were, tell us a little. We were talking before about the immigrant arrival and some of the responses to the immigrants.
Well, when the immigrants come, in New York, they have to kind of claw their way into the machine.
Right.
One of the ways they do that is go out and organize their fellows and then win elections.
And then the machine subverts them and brings them in.
Well, then the machine brings them in. Co-ops them is a better word.
Or they're also challenging them. Remember, John Lew's first race for city council, his biggest enemy was the Democratic Party.
Right.
They were the ones who were challenging his race.
Exactly.
And these elections that have happened in New York City, voting is great, but it doesn't happen easily. There are a number of times in which Asian Americans have been harassed in the poll sites. The way that Chinatown has been drawn, if you look at how the district has been drawn, you see why Asians have always lost, is because you put Chinatown in with Battery Park City, Tribeca, these wealthy neighborhoods who overwhelm the Chinatown vote. We saw in this past race that there was racial profiling in Kevin Kim's race, where campaigners were pegged with rocks and a football, and actually racial epithets were used in that race. So part of this, and this is the history of voting in America as well, and in New York, is that voting also has a safety price, that voter suppression, as you know, in some communities, racial hatred, violence, the inability to get an interpreter. There are a number of structural barriers. As a lawyer, I defend the right to vote, and I assure you that in New York City, we are still trying to make sure that some of the most vulnerable among us have the right to vote free of discrimination, bias, and harassment, and in their own language. That is not an easy thing for some people.
Well, I also think with the Asian community, particularly emergence in Flushing, which is out in Queens, for those who don't know, with the emergence of Asian community in Flushing, the Asian community emerged economically ahead of emerging politically. And what that actually meant to the Asian community is that they were harassed by, some of the more successful businessmen were harassed. Some of them were actually brought up on a variety of charges because they were being successful businessmen. If you go to any part of the United States, a typical town in the United States, the political structure in the business community is like this. It's like hand in glove. If you want to get, anything done, zoning, building permit, grease moves the wheels. When you're cut off, and that's really what happened, I think, initially in Flushing, when you were cut off from that, it's impossible. And so, the John Liu example is his opponent in, I believe it was the 99 race, who famously said about the Asian community in Flushing, who now supported Liu and now have elected another Asian councilman, famously said, they have come here to colonize us. Now, if you drive through Flushing, Flushing was wiped out before the Asians moved in. In the time that Liff was a young whippersnapper working for the progressive movement in Brooklyn, that you could go and rent. You could get a shop or a facility in Flushing for rent free. And that's what happened. The Asians moved in, and they started businesses, and then the largely Jewish and other people who were there were actually quite envious at the Asian rising in Flushing, and they really worked hard not to allow political emergence. So you're absolutely right.
In the 2001 election, in the 2001 election, when John Liu went up against the Democratic machine, correct me if I'm wrong, the Democratic Party was supporting another Chinese American candidate. Is that correct? Was it Ethel Chen, or wasn't there a? So it was not.
That was the New York Times editorial
New York Times.
page.
New York Times is never like John Liu.
Yeah, they don't. I don't know. I think they
Never.
don't like his dad. Is actually what I
Well,
think.
probably. But that's at New York Times. They don't vote necessarily.
But you were talking also about, on a national level, the reaction against immigration is being played out in an amendment that Senator Vitter is talking
Oh yeah,
about.
the Vitter Amendment passes.
Senator Vitter is from Louisiana.
Yeah, they're very concerned in Louisiana that they're going to lose a congressional seat because of Katrina and the population loss after Katrina. So he came up with this idea not to allow illegal immigrants to be counted for reapportionment redistricting. And then they pointed out to him that this would destroy the census. If he put, like, are you illegal on the census, the participation rate in the census would probably drop. So then he said, well, we'll put, he now his revised amendment is ask if you're a citizen. If that passes, you know, New York will lose an extra congressional seat, California will lose 5 congressional seats, a bunch of other states, Illinois will lose a congressional seat. But then if you look within the state, I mean, it'll disempower downstate, it'll lose 2 Senate seats, the area that John Liu represents, the area in the Bronx that the Hispanic community represents, the area in Brooklyn, which is represented by large Caribbean-born people. All of those areas will be really, really disempowered.
And that's the next campaign, right? After these elections in April, we will have the census. And because of what
Let's
the census does, well, we will have it, I mean, depending on who it counts, but we'll have the census because the census and its data is used to determine political power, influence, to apportion not only seats, but
social
also
service funding, I mean, a whole
hospitals,
range of
teachers,
things.
ESL programs, job training programs. We as communities of color, even those of us who are documented, who live in illegal conversions, have so much at stake. And we do want to make sure that everyone participates in the census. We all lose out if we have a bad count here in New York City, in our communities. The ability to have bilingual ballots is driven by census data.
Right.
And so
Affirmative
that's the
action.
next question. That's affirmative action, a number of programs. And what we see in Washington, D.C. are these shenanigans to try to deal with structures that historically have been given so that all residents of the United States can have some form of representation. The reason why we count undocumented immigrants in the census is to make sure that when we apportion congressional seats, when we redraw districts, we take into account that there are communities who need some level of representation. Even though they may not vote, they may vote someday.
Right.
They are here today, and they deserve that representation. The Vitter Amendment is devastating, and we've been working at the Legal Defense Fund to try to fight it as our colleagues across the United States. So we'll see what we can do there.
One of the things I always remember about Guillermo Linares' election, I covered some of that as a reporter, was the degree to which there was Puerto Rican leadership that was not ready to see a Dominican emergence. I haven't seen that between Chinese American and Korean American quite so much, but it could be that I'm just not seeing it. But I mean, do you still get, the degree to which the world was a lot simpler when I grew up, that it's more richly complicated and in a good sense. Are there intra-Latino, ethnically defined struggles?
I think among some leaders, there's that kind of friction, and you have these growing communities, obviously, and not only Dominicans, you have the Mexican community that's really, growing
than anybody else.
and undercounted, So, but I think that there's also a sense that there's too few of us and too few of us who are committed to progressive vision to sort of like, say, well, no, you can't be here and you can't come up, et cetera. And the orientation, this is why I mentioned some of the folks that have come up from Idanis Rodriguez, who it took Idanis 3 times to get into office, and Julissa and some of the other folks, is the orientation is really around, and Melissa Mark Viverito from El Barrio is really, we need to look at issues that are really priority for working class Latinos, which is like affordable housing, education, or public schools. So for those kind of folks and who are a younger generation, there's a real clarity that there needs to be a cohesion and an agenda, whether you're Puerto Rican, Dominican, or Mexican, that the representation needs to be effective for the whole community.
And that intersection becomes important across the board for kind of a coalition of efforts, because that seems to me where what Jesse Jackson would call the economic common ground is. Affordable housing, quality education. There's frictions very often between groups and so forth,
Right.
but we got to find what is the common ground. What are the issues around which we can rally in order to make significant change? Otherwise, again, they'll be divided and exploit, and those who have run the system will continue to do so, and we have an obligation to try to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Right, we're all in the same crappy boat, so it's like...
As long as it doesn't sink, although it seems to be taking on water at the moment. On a national level, you see Latinos about to pass blacks or have already passed blacks as the largest minority. We can use the word minority on a national level, although I'm still searching for the proper word to use in this city when everybody's a minority. But I mean, are there political implications nationally for Latinos passing African Americans?
Well, there shouldn't be. I mean, yeah, there are. I mean, actually,
Well, they shouldn't be, but are there?
well, I mean, I think obviously, there's a way in which this gets played. I mean, there's a whole thing about this. I mean, because there's a way of trying to pit Latinos against African Americans, and our responsibility is to see that this age-old game of divide and exploit does not happen. And it means vigor, and it's not bland for me. I mean, it does mean we have to communicate. Now, I'm a strong believer, as we build coalitions, that we have an obligation to sit down around the table and discuss what our interests are, and what our issues are, and how do we work collectively to find the common ground and move forward. So we can't really can't afford a Latino African American, and again, African American is in question now because you have this very diverse, black community now that has all these constituent elements. We cannot afford that divide. And so we have to, again, have the dialogue, and we need progressive leadership to point the coalition towards the kind of changes that we need at the national level also.
And the reading of it is really important because you had, for example, like leading up, of course, to the presidential elections, Hispanics are not going to vote for a black president, for a black nominee. And what was the turnout? 70%, in favor of Barack Obama. The other thing you had that doesn't get covered, for example, because Numbers USA, which is a front, which touts itself as a sort of, immigration policy organization when it really has an anti-immigrant agenda, their thing is to sort of try to pick off black against Hispanic workers, which is, really bogus. But you don't see in the press, for example, you have an undocumented immigrant who took up refuge sanctuary in Chicago, Elvira Arellano, and when she was taking up sanctuary for a year to protest immigration policies, a number of African-American ministers, including Jesse Jackson's, all came to support her. But that's not the kind of dynamic that you see get played out.
Right.
Well, I think another point has to be made. I mean, the immigrants in New York are very different than the immigrants in the United States. When you say immigrants in the United States, what the subtext is Mexicans.
Right.
Yeah.
When you
No,
say
that's right.
immigrants
I
in
think
New
that's
York,
right.
they're so diverse. I mean, and it's an amazing thing. I mean, we've only suddenly gotten a large, sizable share of the Mexican, or of a large, sizable share of Mexicans in New York. I mean, there were only 30,000 Mexicans counted in the 1990 census. Now there's a couple, 250,000 probably. So you have to take that into account. So Latino in the U.S. context is largely Mexican with probably a little Cuban beat in there.
I want to go to a question, but just one point is I covered too many elections in Brooklyn in which, for instance, African Americans versus Caribbean was the defining distinction. In some cases, it was English-speaking Caribbean versus Haitian. So, I mean, you had ethnic campaigns within the black community.
Well, yeah, that happens, as it happens in all communities. And one of the things, again, there, and that's something I'm particularly working on, because we're working on something called Pan-African Unity Dialogue, because we're trying to make sure those divides don't cripple our ability to be effective. So those things happen, but again, it's about communications. It's about understanding what our mutual interests are and how we then merge those with the broader community of colors and progressives of all ethnicities and backgrounds in order to forge, a better union in the city of New York.
Let me take a question. Tell us your name and your campus.
My name is Israel, and I'm a student at LaGuardia Community College, Queens. My question is for Erica. And I was watching a Mexican immigrant. I grew up in East Harlem. I lived in California, and I saw how Mexicans were, like the majority, Latinos in California, how well we were represented out there. And when I came here with my parents, I saw like a unbalance between us Latinos. Do you think there's a way for us to unite, like not just Mexicans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans, but Ecuadorians and Peruvians, South Americans, and Central Americans?
Well, there's really no other option. I mean, you're never going to have this sort of idyllic, everyone links arms and we get along famously all the time, but again, like it's a question that we get at the paper, at El Diario, is like, how do you cover all of these different groups, And the way we cover these groups is by looking at the ties that bind. And the issues that affect all of these groups across the board, affordable housing, quality schools, all of these healthcare. These are all the kind of issues, and even with immigration, with folks who are not immigrants, because one of the commonalities is language, So it's Puerto Rican. It was recently at an El Diario event. Gerardo Rivera was talking about how Puerto Ricans don't necessarily have a dog in this fight, but we're committed to it, and it's because there's a commonality in terms of language discrimination, and just we took our knocks, and that resonates with what other communities are going through.
Glenn, you don't have language across the board within the Asian American community. You know, it's not only nationality distinct, but it's language distinct. Does that hurt forging a coalition?
Probably. I mean, I think for Asian Americans, like other communities, we come to the political process and to civic participation from a different place. I think that each one of us, I think we do believe that how do we come together and work on issues of common struggle with other Asian American ethnic groups, with other immigrant groups from different countries. And I think each one of our groups deals with issues in their own community in their own different ways. There's Chinese publications, Bangladeshi publications, publications in Korean, so the languages are so much more complex. And doing work, Pan-Asian organizing, does mean that something has to be translated to 7 different Asian languages. That is much more difficult. Of course, LA, things are translated by the government into 7 different Asian languages. If they can do it, certainly New York City can do it as well. But it is a challenge, and it does recognize that people come to the process from different histories, with different languages, with different cultures. But there are, I think that's right, that there are issues that bind, like education, housing, healthcare, that all of our communities, jobs, are all losing out.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Charlie Sambo. I'm from Hunter College, and my question is, when and by what factors does minority group classification cease? Like, for instance, Germans and Italians at one point were considered minorities in the city, and I would assume that no longer pertains.
It's a very good question. I mean, something that really, really confuses me as to how to use language. I mean, does the word minority in this city mean anything?
Well, I think it means
You're the demographer.
Well, I think there's this the obvious answer to that is that there's a set group of protected groups in the United States which are done through affirmative action, which includes you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it's Hispanics, African Americans, Native Americans, Asians. Am I missing anybody? Disabled.
Well, you're missing gay people who are not legally included in that yet. But
I think that I think we've been white for a long time. I mean, I'll say this personally. I'm from European descent. We've been white for an awful long time. In 1911, Congress wanted to set up like 186 races, and they had a commission. There was going to be a Norwegian race and a French race and this race and that race, and the Census Bureau said, no, it's white.
Not then. They do now.
What?
Now there's 163 racial groups.
Well,
no,
but they're permutations.
No, but I mean, when we become no longer a minority, when that group, that definable population, has achieved a level of political, social, and economic parity and power within the society. When the Irish are no longer a discriminated class, but they run the city of Boston, maybe they're no longer a minority. Or maybe they are. I mean, the term minority is... It's a legal term of art. It's a political term, and I think that's right. That we have difficulties in identifying what that is.
Well, for New York State and for CUNY, Italians are a protected minority because they just don't get ahead on their own, apparently.
Or they were a protected minority because they were there were Italian leaders who were politically skilled enough to get them designated as such for some purpose of access. And I don't mean this cynically. I mean that.
Well, except it's very difficult. If you run any of the numbers, the Italians look just like the Irish and all the other, white groups. When you run any kind of economic deprivation numbers, education, etc., whereas Latinos, African Americans, etc., are very clearly still in many ways deprived, and some but not all of the Asian American groups or Asian American.
Right. Yeah, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that America was really not established to be a nation of people of color. I mean, it was broadly established, not even all white people. It was it was established essentially as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture.
Property-owning country.
And then, therefore the Italians had some difficulties, Eastern Europeans and so forth and so on. But even then, really, it seems to me the defining reality was, other than white, has been seen as the minority and people to be discriminated against. So even if you were Irish and Italian and so forth and so on, there was a commonality of discrimination against people of color. It tended to be historically
Well, that's the old, I mean, that's, that argument was always made about racism in the South, is that, whites were so poor that they needed blacks, so they had somebody beneath them. That it was that, that there was an economic system that was aimed at oppressing blacks in order to keep poor whites quiet.
Well, it's no question, but that there was a heavy psychological piece here. The symbolism is something that people unfortunately were bought in order to stay into the system where actually blacks and whites in the old days, the whole slogan of black and white unite and fight made sense, but because of the psychological association of Jim Crow, they got Jim Crow.
Also, going back just to make one point, I'm going to go to another question, but the Democratic Party, the genius of the Democratic Party co-opting insurgents was to bring all those immigrants, because those immigrants, once they became citizens, and in those days you probably didn't even have to be a citizen to vote.
Not locally.
Not locally, you bring them in to vote, and it took a longer time for the Democratic Party to realize that the same applied to blacks, and in particular Brooklyn. I know the history of Brooklyn, where you had blacks who were brought in by the Democratic Party, and it took a mammoth coalition for community empowerment insurgency in Brooklyn to kind of pick off what in those days were called the Meade Esposito black elected officials, to kind of move politics in a more progressive as opposed to purely party serving way. I'm rambling. I apologize.
Yes, let's go to his motion.
My name is Mitchell Partnow from Brooklyn College. And recently, the Haitian community elected Matthew Eugene to the city council as the first Haitian elected official. I was wondering what your thoughts were on if the likelihood of a Haitian American becoming a borough-wide official in Queens or Brooklyn within the next 4 years.
Has Obama? Let me rephrase that. Has Obama changed that calculus?
Well, I think he's going to have to build coalition. He'll have to do like John Lew did, and reach out to all of the other groups. Have to reach out to John Lew was brilliant in that. He reached out to the Black Coalition, he reached out to the Latinos, he reached back to the Jewish club that Julie Harrison came out of, who called him, suggested that the Asians were colonizing Flushing. So, that's what you have to do.
But John Lew didn't do it on its own. He also had his opponents who actually helped him with that. So if you remember, who was it that ran against him, ran for Yvette Clarke's district? Oh, what's his name?
Yasky. Right.
Yasky ran for Yvette Clarke. Now that is a district that was specifically designed to give representation to African Americans who had a history of discrimination. And then here comes this white guy saying, I'm going to run. All the black people, they're all running and they're all going to divide the vote. And I'll try to win it. This is David Yasky. And so, remarkably presumptuous, saying, I, as a white man, will take over and represent the black community of Brooklyn. So, obviously, he lost. Yvette Clarke won. That's exciting. Now comes another race where it's Yasky versus John Lew. Where did the African Americans go? Especially in Brooklyn, they did not go for Mr. Yasky. They went for Mr. Lew, and that makes sense. So part of it was also his opponents driving the wedge and playing the bad race politics that also really helped him. John was just very good at capitalizing on that, and it was brilliant. He pulled together the old Dinkins coalition, and it's not just the ethnic coalitions. It's also the regional coalitions. He traveled everywhere across the city. It is the gay and lesbian groups, the religious groups, the political clubs, the old-timers.
And to that point, I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you, but
go.
on his victory speech or victory remarks on the primary, he wasn't endorsed by any of the English,
that's right,
English
that's
language.
right.
He wasn't endorsed
That's
by any of
right.
the English language, big three, but he thanked the Irish Voice, El Diario, a number of Asian papers, the Amsterdam News, so it was fascinating to
It was
hear
very
that.
telling. It was a wonderful thing
Yeah,
to
that
say.
I loved.
Yes.
That I loved. And it went to the power of ethnic media in New York City. That is not necessarily, New Yorkers are not, well, some New Yorkers are reading the New York Times, the Daily News, and Newsday, but so many other New Yorkers are reading, the paper.
But on the Haitian question, because this is an area that I spent a lot of time on, and I know Matthew Eugene and so forth. So the Haitian group is really like many other groups. It's in the first stage of beginning to mature and to get its people registered and so forth. There is a deputy Manhattan borough president in Manhattan, And there was an insurgency in the district of Leroy Comrie, led by a Haitian American who was embraced by a broader group of people and so forth. So I think there is the prospect, there is the possibility that Haitians are going to begin to run borough-wide. They do have a significant.
But they won't vote. But they won't run borough-wide as Haitians per se.
Of course not.
I mean, it will be a candidate. I mean, you
John
draw
Lewis,
from your own, but you can't win with your own.
well, of course not, and that's rather than if you want to use John Lew again as the
Same
model.
point, same point as John.
I mean, we are certainly aware that John Lew is Asian. I mean, that's not lost on us. And quite frankly, from as far as I'm concerned, given the whole history of white dominance in politics, I am going to be inclined, to be in favor of John Lew for that reason, particularly if he's progressive, and certainly his politics lead in that direction. So I think Haitians are on the ladder. It's a ladder process. They'll move up the ladder eventually, and it's not inconceivable that they can go borough-wide and even citywide at some point.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Avani Rampasad from CUNY Queens College. My question is, has the election of these so-called minority leaders actually been proven that they better represent these groups in their district than the previous predominantly white leaders?
Excellent question. Does I mean, does
I think so. In some way, in some level, I think so. Were it not for minority leaders and representatives in the city council, we would not see a language access bill that requires city agencies to translate services into several minority languages. And not just the Asian languages, Russian, Spanish, some of the European languages as well. That we see that the government is a little bit more receptive, that someone can talk to the police department about why are you not prosecuting some of these crimes and you're prosecuting the others. So I do think that in some level, the government is more responsive when somebody is there to hold the systems of government, the hospitals, the police, whoever it is, the garbage collectors, accountable to the community. So I do think. Now, whether that's progressive social change, that might be a different question. But is it better for those communities who have been shut out and forgotten? I think so, yeah.
Well, it also may give them a certain amount of patronage too. So
Well, yeah, but
which is not necessarily, so there might be some jobs. I really think that you have to look at politics as fairly instrumental. I mean, it really is who gets what, when, where, and I mean, why. And I think that if the minorities aren't in it, they're not playing. They're not going to get much.
We've got 10 minutes left. I want to try to get some more questions.
My name is Tia Phim, and I'm a student at John Jay College. And my question to you is, why did it take so long for Asian Americans to get into office? And does that mean we don't like to vote for one another?
Why did it take so long?
I think Asian Americans come to, as we talked about, they come into the political process. Many of us were not United States citizens, and you have to be a citizen to vote. Many of us did become citizens, but we weren't necessarily registered to vote. Why vote? What do they do for us? What is the political process all about? It's too much of a bother. So like other racial and ethnic minority groups, and it's not very different from any other group historically on how they come to the process. Your second point, though, whether we vote for each other, now that's interesting. I mean, we actually have done polling where we found that there are a number of times in which we've seen Asian Americans voting for other Asian candidates. Asian Americans, South Asians in Floral Park will vote for Gregory Meeks, an African American member of Congress. We've seen Black Latino coalitions. The question becomes when you have a race where you have someone who's Chinese, someone who's Korean, someone who's Indian, and someone who's Puerto Rican, and someone who's, that is where the ethnic divides are very powerful, right? And then they do diversify, right? Hopefully, but not 5 people will win. Then it starts to bubble up, and then it wins.
Well, that's one of the reasons Chinatown didn't have an Asian American initially.
They always had
because
like 12,
there was a split.
12 candidates.
There was
running,
a split in the
I
white.
don't, those.
Well, the
I've looked at
original,
those
the
numbers.
2001, that was true.
Well, they had the split. If you put the numbers together, remember the second person who won in that race was Brad Hoylman, who was white.
Yeah.
So if you put all the white candidates together, they sort of overwhelm all the Asian votes, even if you put them all together.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a conventional wisdom, but if you look at it from a legal analysis and actually through studying the voting patterns, you see a very different shift.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Koen Kim, and I'm from LaGuardia Community College. As the actual constituents are getting diverse, one of the compelling factors for choosing a voter is ethnic background or race. What could it be it could actually degenerate the whole content of politics. So what could be a way to lead public to pay more attention to the actual content of politics and beyond the ethnic backgrounds or race?
In other words, ethnicity can be a dividing factor, and focusing on ethnicity can damage the ability to accomplish. Is that the point you're making?
That's my question.
Well, I believe in in-group identification and out-group association. So I think that many of these groups who come to the process are coming to the process because they're being excluded, and the ethnicity becomes a basis for unity, and it becomes a basis for therefore organizing to get into the political process. And it's never, I'm not aware of it ever having been otherwise. And frankly, I don't have a problem with that. I think that people who have specific issues, particular areas of interest, I'm not one of those who sees this as balkanization or somehow is fragmenting the whole idea of America. I think it's very rich. I think it's very quite refreshing, actually. The key is to reach out beyond one's ethnicity to, at least as a progressive leader, hopefully, to connect with others who are looking at how to build a better city and a better nation. So, but I don't argue with the idea of people first organizing ethnically, because they do that out of a sense of necessity and out of a sense of the naturalness of their sort of the community. And then you go, but the challenge is to go beyond that in order to build a broader coalition.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Theodore Telfort, and I am a student at Hunter College. And my question is in reference to Dr. Beveridge's comment about economic common grounds. Do you believe that there must be solutions in terms of improving the economic developments of certain diverse communities?
Do I personally believe that? Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, I think that one of the things, I mean, this is my own view, but I think that we've seen, we're now going into a third term of a mayor that basically is in the pocket of a bunch of developers. Massive tax subsidies have gone to Yankee Stadium, Atlantic Yards, Hudson Yards, all of these development projects where the city is actually on the hook. And if we continue to, if the economics don't turn around, we're going to really find out how much on the hook we are, because a lot of these were financed basically with city funds. And is that helping for affordable housing? Is that helping the schools, which have a $7 billion tax anticipation bonding for new construction? Is that helping us hire better teachers? I don't see it.
See, and I think as we talked about this earlier, the whole question of the nature of a progressive coalition, that's where the challenge is. The challenge is to have an economic common ground or a social justice agenda, however you want to define it, where we can see these commonalities, because there's really no way that a mayor should get away with that, short term, long term.
But third term.
Yeah, and so I think there will come a time when we will be able to organize to really challenge those kind of things and to really make it a much more democratic and a much more friendly city as it relates to working people.
And that's small d democratic.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Luther Eason. I'm from Queens College. And actually, I was born and raised in Flushing. I was brought up and raised in Flushing. My question is more or less in response to Professor Andrews' question about the businesses in Flushing. I noticed as growing up, when the neighborhood was transitioning from Asian and from the Jewish and the Italian neighborhoods there was a lot of respect to the zoning rights. As the neighborhoods became a more of a transitional neighborhood, and a lot of the people within that neighborhood maybe did not have the right to vote, there was actually over-exploitation of the neighborhood. Perfect example of that would be Cherry Avenue Casino, which was leveled. All the beauty of that street and a lot of the things that made Flushing were taken away because of the businesses there took advantage of that. So such a large population was not able to vote or to participate. So my question is, what do you propose doing to protect these communities as they transition and so many people can't participate in the voting process?
I mean,
well, one of the
briefly,
things actually that's been put on the table in the city council is allowing legal permanent residents to vote in local elections. And it's not a bold or radical move. At one time, 20-something states, allowed immigrants to vote in local elections. So it would be restoring this right now.
Basically, it would be our business, not the rest of the country's.
Right, it would be our business, right?
Yeah.
I want to get one more question in, if I could.
Hi, my name's Alex from LaGuardia Community College, and my question is for Erica. Do you think the Democratic Party takes for granted the Latino vote, given that their reach into our community has decreased over the past few years, while individuals such as Mayor Bloomberg has, now speaks Spanish and has campaigned heavily into our community. Do you think in the future it'll become a liability instead of a?
Do they take?
I think
do
that
they take do they-
yes with a big Y, which is why you have somebody like Pedro Espada, a state senator, who can take advantage of that argument and sort of like navigate all over the place, But it is a real issue about Democrats taking Hispanics for taking advantage of Hispanics
Same thing
or
with
for
blacks
granted,
and
rather.
same anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. But Bloomberg, Bloomberg speaking Spanish, I think we've gotten over that part. I mean, the Spanish is just not going to cut it, And it has to be more about, well, what are you doing about affordable housing, about jobs, about education?
Well, Bloomberg did actually not do that well with the Hispanic community during the last election, despite the massive propaganda to the contrary. And if you took a look at the,
Except that you had a Latino challenger.
But
Freddie
he put out he put out all this PR that he did very well among the Hispanics, and he didn't. He got about 20% of the Hispanic vote if you take racial bloc voting analysis or the exit polling that was done later. So I mean,
But didn't Latinos voted for Bloomberg?
No, they did not.
Well, what was it in 2001?
He's talking about 2005.
About a
I don't know
third.
about 2001.
2001 they voted
third.
against Green.
Right. It was in reaction to Green.
Okay,
African-Americans, some
that's good.
African-Americans did too.
I think. I mean, it's just interesting how. I mean, I think that's a question because I remember back then that we definitely recognize the Latino vote is not a democratic vote. That it will vote for their interests.
Well, not
that
if
they
you
will
offend
look
it.
for. Right. I mean, that's the question now. It's just fascinating to me how it now has been taken. How we are now back to the Latinos being taken for granted in the Democratic Party.
We need a progressive rainbow coalition as the third force in politics in the city of New York.
I'm about to get the goodbye, and I always make deadline. I think that one of the lessons from the emergence of John Liu carries the possibility we will have an Asian American mayor. It carries the possibility that ethnicity is no longer the kind of bar it was, and maybe things are looking up.